Hello again. So what we're going to talk about in this session is some of the challenges to reducing greenhouse gas emissions via the problem of how do we get a global agreement. So the first question we want to ask ourselves is, what is the global context and why do we need a global agreement? Well, as we know, greenhouse gas emissions or pollution in any country, whether it's Australia or Bangladesh or the US or China, adds to the global stock of emissions. And it's this global stock of emissions that creates climate change. And those emissions sit around for decades and decades, if not centuries. And it's this global stock of emissions that's going to cause climate change, that's going to cause changes to our agriculture, to our ability to heat and warm ourselves, to our water availability and so on. And the costs are going to be borne for long times into the future. So the interesting story is that the benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by any particular country reduce the global stock of pollution, which then provides benefits to every other country. And that's, if you like, the two global dimensions. A, that pollution anywhere adds to the global stock, and then B, that global stock affects climate change. And if any country is going to reduce emissions, it's going to benefit not only itself, but also every other country in the globe. And of course, we know that there are benefits and costs. And the challenge is when we look at the costs of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, involved by choosing more expensive production methods or different goods and services that don't quite meet our tastes as well as the polluting ones. Or we have to invest money in research and development and in sequestration. So the challenging issue is that the costs of mitigation, of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, are borne by the individual country. So if Australia decides to reduce its pollution, then almost all those costs are borne by Australians, not by the Chinese or the Americans. And vice versa, if the Chinese were to reduce their pollution, then they would bear all the costs. And of course, they would only get a share of the benefits. And so the challenge is we really want a global agreement so that we get all countries involved, all countries reducing their emissions, and we'd like that to be done in a cost-effective way, and we'd like somebody to monitor that every country's doing what it says. Now, if we had a global government, then that might be possible. But in fact, the best global government we've got is the United Nations. And that can suggest to countries they should do something, can even find them guilty of doing something and say, nasty, nasty. But an individual country has sovereignty to do as it wants. So the challenge is we have to get a cooperative global agreement. And that's what the Kyoto Protocol was an attempt. It's what the Copenhagen meeting, the Durban meeting, the Cancun meetings were about. We're trying to get a global voluntary agreement. But when we think about it, the incentive for individual countries is not to join the global agreement, but actually the free ride. So why does that happen? So if an individual country implements policies such as a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme or regulations or subsidies to reduce its pollution, it bears all the costs of those decision changes. And if you remember back to earlier sessions, we measured that cost as the area under the marginal abatement cost curve. But the trouble is it receives only a small share of the global benefits. Remember, reduction in pollution by one country reduces the global stock of pollution, and that then provides benefits to every country in the globe, not just the country that reduced its pollution. So the country who reduces its pollution only gets a share of the global benefits. So what if a country took another strategy and said, I'm going to wait for other countries to reduce their pollution. I'll just sit them aside and have business as usual. Then it incurs no costs of mitigation decisions, doesn't have to implement a tax or tradable permit scheme, doesn't have to change its decisions. But if other countries reduce their pollution, then that means less global pollution, less climate change in the future. They get some of the gain. So if we look at these two strategies, it leads to a selfish decision to leave mitigation to others. I can get some benefits and no costs, whereas if I do mitigation, I bear lots of costs and only get some of the benefits. So the result is what we call in economics a prisoner's dilemma game. We do our individual selfish thing, but if we were actually cooperating as a society, we could all jointly be better off. So we really would like to have a global agreement. But why is it so hard to do? Well, it has to be voluntary. As we just discussed, yes, we have organisations like the United Nations to get us to talk to each other, but they can't really force an agreement. Now we can contrast that for a particular country where the government of our country, the Australian government or the US government or the Chinese government, can really force every business and household within its jurisdiction to do as the government wishes. Of course, the government might be ticked out in a couple of years' time if it doesn't do what people wish. So a simplified version of why it's so hard to get a global agreement, think of the case of just developing countries and developed countries. So most developed countries, like the OECD countries, at the moment have relatively high incomes. And where did they get those high incomes? Well, a lot of it came from the Industrial Revolution, which they've been through for a couple of centuries, and that involved a lot of greenhouse gas pollution. Manufacturing, the burning of fossil fuels were all big parts of why they are so rich. On the other hand, if we look at developing countries, I hesitate to put China in that list, but they are, India, much of Africa and Latin America, they still low income and high levels of poverty. They would like to have higher incomes and less poverty. Now, because they've largely been agrarian societies, they haven't been in the Industrial Revolution, they haven't really contributed very much to the global stock of pollution. And we can also point out they would be beneficiaries of less climate change, in particular because they're more dependent on agriculture. So how should the costs of reducing global pollution be shared across different countries? Well, here are some of the options. One is we could grandfather the amount of pollution. So if you've been a big polluter, you get a number of permits equal to your past pollution. This was essentially the Kyoto model for developed countries. That means that the developed countries, we get most of the pollution permits, and the developing countries, very few. They rightly say, that doesn't seem very sensible. That's not fair. You've had the advantage of polluting for 2 centuries, you're now rich. We didn't participate in the Industrial Revolution. We want to become rich like you. I don't see why we should bear all the costs of pollution. An alternative model is that we could allocate the same number of pollution permits per capita. So each Chinese person, each American person, each Icelander, each Australian would get the same permits per capita. That would seem to be fair. Another way of trying to induce developing countries to join a global agreement is we would give them a holiday for a while. Let them go through an industrial revolution that, yes, it does involve pollution, but also helps them develop their incomes and lift most people out of poverty. Then the challenge, of course, what's that threshold going to be? Is it going to be a particular level of pollution, such as so many tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year? Could be the absolute level, or could it be per capita? Or could we set it on real income level? It's not hard to envisage that even if we ask developing countries to come to a global agreement, they will actually disagree amongst themselves. And so these are some of the real challenges. These are the explanations why Copenhagen, Cancun and Durban didn't really meet a satisfactory global agreement. And so we're waiting for bright people who are doing this course to work out a strategy to get us a global agreement.